and welcome back to my channel. I'm so happy to have you here. And I wanted to make this video more from an inquisitive place and a place to kind of share ideas. It's probably going to be a shorter video just because this is a question that's interesting to kind of contemplate, right? This is something that I've seen on the internet a lot, and I know that people have a lot of strong feelings about this. I don't necessarily. I just think it's an interesting idea to explore and an interesting concept to talk about because it is something that's kind of odd, right? There are so many different groups, and obviously this video is centered more towards my American audience, but this could apply to Australia or the UK or anywhere else where there are large populations of Italians or like the Italian diaspora, let's say. But I do think it's interesting to think about because at least like within the United States, there are so many different ethnic groups and let's say different immigrant groups that have gone to the US over the years and made up what is now considered to be the United States of America. And there are so many different groups that have played their roles in developing what is now the United States of America. And I just think it's funny because a lot of those groups have integrated really well into American society, or maybe they don't have the same ideas about where they come from. They don't necessarily care too much about understanding their family history or genealogy and all of that. Whereas Italian Americans are kind of obsessed with this idea. And it's kind of funny to me. It's an interesting thing to think about. One thing I will say is living here in Italy and meeting, let's call them motherland Italians for the sake of this video, okay? Some people might not appreciate that term, but just as a way to make a distinction. You will not probably be considered Italian here if you move here, even if you're of Italian descent, even if your parents were born here in Italy, and unless you were born in Italy yourself, you probably won't be considered Italian by the people that live here. Now, for some of you that come here to Italy, people not considering you Italian might really piss you off, okay? Because I know some people have really firm attachments to being Italian or being Italian American. I don't necessarily. I understand where this idea is coming from, and for me, it's sort of irrelevant. Like the way that I define myself, the way that I identify myself is sort of mine to deal with, okay? I don't really care the way that other people view it. But that said, I do recognize that this could be a topic that would be very difficult for some people, certainly very contentious. Now, this also begs the question, what is an Italian anyway? Because I would venture to say that those same people probably also don't consider the lots of different other immigrant groups that have moved to Italy and have had children here. They probably wouldn't consider like a child that's Moroccan born here in Italy as Italian, or a child from Senegalese parents that was born here Italian. And that's a question and a topic that is very, very complicated and not something that we're necessarily going to get into today, but it does sort of beg the question, what is an Italian? What does it even mean to be an Italian? Is an Italian person someone that was born here? Is an Italian person someone that speaks the language? Is an Italian person someone that just has Italian ancestry and Italian blood, no matter what that percentage is? And if you've watched any of my other videos, you know that I like to get into the history of things. And I do think that it's really interesting to consider the way that Italian Americans were perceived when they first moved to the United States. I've made several videos about this topic. I will link them all in the description box. But, there was a long period of time where Italians were not considered white, okay? And they were sort of othered as a group of people. I think Irish Americans in contrast, or German Americans in contrast, they were by and large, undeniably considered white. I looked back into some historical articles about this, and it looked like back even in the 1790s when they issued the first census, Irish folks were listed as white on those census records, okay? So that's an interesting thing to consider. I don't think that this all comes down to race, but I do think that that's a factor, and I'll tell you why. I'm building my argument here. If you were considered white, especially at that time when we're talking about pre-Civil War and free the emancipation of the enslaved people in the United States, that means that there would have been a lot of separation in society, okay? Now, people that were considered white or had a greater proximity to whiteness would have otherwise been better integrated into what would have been like the upper or middle classes, okay? Irish people were definitely mistreated. They were considered sort of dirty whites, but they were considered whites nonetheless. Now, Italian Americans, by contrast, were not necessarily considered white, and they were even segregated in schools for a period of time. It's like a very interesting topic that I touched on very briefly some time ago, and there are so many good videos about this on YouTube. But, and whether or not Italians are white or not is not necessarily something that I want to get into. This is a complicated topic, and that just begs the question, like, what is a white person? What even defines whiteness? Like, all of these things. It's you guys can discuss it in the comments if you're really interested in that. That's not necessarily the angle that I'm trying to take. I'm just trying to ask the question, what is it that made Italian Americans separated and different from other groups? My point is that ultimately Italians living in the United States were othered, and they were sort of isolated into their communities. And this is something that's common in a lot of different ethnic groups and immigrant groups, but Italian Americans really grouped together to kind of preserve their culture, to preserve their identity, in some cases to preserve their traditions and language and all of these things. Now, I'm not saying all of this to compare what Italians went through in comparison to other groups that were othered, like certainly Black American people or people that were part of the indigenous communities, okay? The amount of discrimination and suffering and stereotyping that went on against those communities is like a totally different level. But Italian Americans were discriminated against very heavily. These were people that were sort of placed into certain categories, and they were only given certain jobs. They were only able to live in certain areas. They were only able to send their kids to certain places. So, that's something to really consider, because those communities stayed very isolated and very insular. I think that we saw a greater development of that culture within the United States. Now, if we take this context post-war, the United States was very actively at war with Germany, Italy, and Japan, right? So there was an increase in discrimination against Italian Americans. Italian Americans really felt like they had to prove themselves. They had to prove how American they were. And this is where we saw a lot of Italian language drop off dramatically, because people didn't want to be considered other than American. They wanted to be considered integrated into society fully. I got into this in another video, and again, I'll link it in the description, but this is something that I think is really important to consider, because this is where we see a lot of the integration happen. By the time soldiers came back from World War II, they had sort of developed a palate and a real interest in Italian culture. Also, post-war, there was a big economic boom that happened in Italy. And so, film, lifestyle culture, food, fashion, all of these things became very popularized. This was also during a period of time where American films were putting out a lot of Italian content as well, okay? So especially if we think about like the 1970s, there were a lot of films surrounding like mafia culture and all of that, okay? So all of these things kind of contributed to the ways that Italians were viewed within American society, and it casts a different idea about this group of people within American culture. But because Italian Americans had been so isolated for so long, they had their own neighborhoods, they had their own streets. Like if we think about Little Italy in New York, for example, I mean, now it's quite small, but there was a period of time where it was a really large chunk of town. A lot of people don't know that there was an Italian part of Harlem as well. So, that's something that's really important to consider too, because they had formed their communities, they had formed their lifestyle that was very much separate from that of larger American society. Now, to bring this full circle more personally, one of the reasons I was so interested growing up and just like wanted to know more about the Italian culture, about where my family comes from, all of these different things, a lot of that came from my grandparents, okay? My grandparents talked a lot about Italian culture. The food that we ate in my family was Italian. My mom handmade pasta all the time. A lot of my friends when I was in school, they loved eating at my family's house because my mom was such a great cook. Okay, she was not only a great cook, but She's also a fantastic baker. So my friends love to come over and spend meals with us, not for nothing, but my best friend still to this day, but also growing up, was Irish American. I remember the first time that I ate at her house and her parents served corned beef and cabbage, which, you know, as a child of Italian origin, I did not have a palate for corned beef and cabbage and hated it, frankly. I just thought it was awful. Now that I'm grown and I have a more developed palate, I like it. But, you know, hopefully my best friend, if she ever watches this, she's not going to feel a type of way. But yeah, you know, it's just really interesting thinking about that, because I don't know what your guys' experiences were like if you're part of the Italian American community, but it was just very different growing up in that kind of family structure. You know, my parents, we weren't necessarily raised as Catholics, but both of my parents were. And so they had a lot of Catholic traditions behind the traditions that we grew up with. For example, on Christmas, you know, we didn't celebrate Christmas on the 25th necessarily, okay? We always celebrated on the 24th. And that's something that's really common in, I think, Catholic societies worldwide, but especially here in Italy, like they do a huge dinner on the 24th. That's really typical. So, you know, these are traditions that sort of trickled down from generations. When I was sent to school, I didn't eat school lunch, okay? My mom always sent me to school with like typical Italian food. And it's an interesting thing, because the relationship that I had with the food at the time, it was like, I kind of wanted to be like the other kids, but the other kids wanted to eat my food because they considered my food to be tastier, okay? So I don't know what your guys' relationship to growing up Italian American was. If you grew up in a part of the country where there were really large Italian American communities, then of course that forms part of your culture and that forms part of your identity and how you grew up, your mentality, you know, just the way that you perceive the world around you. So it's no surprise to me that people that grow up in those kinds of neighborhoods would have a greater relationship and pride about their culture, right? Like that's just something that's really, really typical. So then that also makes me question, you know, where does this contention between motherland Italians and people within the United States of Italian origin come from? Because I guess I don't know, because I'm not a motherland Italian, right? But something that I've heard from them is like, first of all, from their perspective, if you're third or fourth or fifth generation and so on removed, from their perspective, it's like, why do you care? You're American now. Like, why are you so attached to this culture? But also because, you know, Italian Americans are quite different from motherland Italians. Food, culture, like lots of different things. And this is really typical. I've heard of this happening in several different immigrant groups as well. People that have come from China or people that have come from India or even Mexico. The people that moved to the United States, they kind of had these different traditions that maybe the motherland that they came from evolved and changed and grew in a very different way that those people are now no longer a part of, but they maintain those same ideas in the new country that they now are a part of. And so I guess part of the contention is that they just don't feel like we're very similar. And you know what? I can see that, and I can really respect that idea. I do think that we're quite different. It doesn't take anything away from my experience though, you know, and then coming back and moving here has been really very, very interesting and very, I don't want to say spiritual, but kind of in a way. Like it's given me a really deep respect for my ancestors, what they went through, like, and I've talked about this before in other videos, but like going to the town of origin that my family came from and just seeing where it is, like what it looks like, what the terrain is like there, it would have been really hard for them to immigrate. And the fact that some of them did it multiple times is bananas to me. But all that to say, it just gives me a really deep respect, starting to understand like the culture and the traditions, the hardships that a lot of them went through. It has really created a deeper understanding of my ancestors and their mentality and why they did things the way that they did, right? So all that to say, I'm really curious to understand. This video is mostly made to kind of open up a dialogue with those of you that are of Italian origin. Again, whether it's you being in the United States or Canada or the UK or Australia, even Argentina, if anybody wants to engage. But what is it that makes you feel so connected to your Italian origins, even maybe being several generations removed? Why is it so important for you to grow and learn and understand more about where your ancestors come from, as opposed to people that are maybe of German descent or Irish descent? I really like to understand more about where those ideas come from. That said, thank you for watching this video. I hope it was something that's more thought-provoking. It's not simply me just projecting my ideas on you. I want to really know from you guys, what is it that your experience has been? Why is it that you guys grew up with the mentality that you did and your love for culture? Obviously, you enjoy it because you're subscribed to this channel, okay? You want to know more. That's part of the reason why you follow the videos that I make, right? So that said, please do like, share, comment, subscribe. I love reading your guys' comments and I love engaging with you guys. It's really fun for me to do that. And I hope that this opens up a larger dialogue about the relationship maybe between motherland Italians and people of Italian origin in the diaspora. So thank you so much for watching this video. I hope you enjoyed it, and I will see you in the next video.